Hey guys, welcome to another photography class. Today I want to talk a little bit more about the artistic side of photography as opposed to the more technical side that we've been talking to up until now. So we're going to talk today about composition. So composition, simply put, is just the elements that are in your photo, where they're placed. You can tell a different story depending on things like your angle or your foreground and your background, things like that. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. The first rule of thumb that I want to talk about is probably the best known. You may have heard the term rule of thirds. So what the rule of thirds basically is if you were to take your image and break it into 3 equal pieces horizontally and vertically so that you would have kind of a grid over top of your image, you should place your subject on one of the intersection points of those lines or along one of the lines themselves. I'm going to show you some examples here. So you can see here the grid lines. I've got 2 horizontal lines and 2 vertical lines, and the cat's face is right on one of those intersection points. Here are 2 examples of using the horizon line along one of the third lines, and I want to show you 2 examples because I want to show you the difference that it can make, whether you're emphasizing the water in this example or the sky. The great thing about rule of thirds that I should note is that you don't have to necessarily be aware of it while you're taking the pictures, because you can always crop the photo afterwards, and most crop tools allow you to see the grid as you're cropping. One last example where my subject is also a very strong vertical element in my shot. You can see here that I've placed it along one of the 2 vertical dividing lines. The next one I want to talk about is called lead room. So what lead room is, it's a pretty simple thing. If you have something that could be moving or could be looking in a direction, so anything that's alive, an animal or a person, or anything that's moving like a vehicle, for example, you want to give it space to move into. So for example, if you're taking a picture of a person and you want a picture in profile, sideways, like this, then you're going to want to leave more room in front of the person than behind, because if you have all of this space behind and the person is looking this way and there's not a whole lot of space right here, you're sort of creating tension with that image. It's the same when you see an image of, just say for example, a car, and the car is facing this way. If the frame is right here and the car is right here, then it creates sort of a tension. You can use that on purpose to create tension in your image, but I always say just learn the rules before you break them, because then you know what effect it's having. So again, it's sort of the same thing as the rule of thirds, where you don't want to center things. Instead, you want to give more space in the direction that your subject is looking or going. Even if it's somebody who's walking, you're going to want to do the same thing. If the person is walking in that direction, then you're going to want to leave all that space in front of them. Next, let's talk about leading lines. So as simply as I can make it, leading lines are something that take your eye and lead it toward a certain part of your image. Your eyes naturally want to follow lines that are in photographs, and so you can use that strategically to invite the viewer to either look from left to right, or possibly from the front of your photo to the back of your photo, or to lead them directly to your subject. Those can be things like roadways or pathways. That's kind of a simple one, but also fences. Literally anything that makes a line in your photograph can be used strategically that way. Here's just a really tiny example of leading lines where the pathway leads right to the gazebo. So if I was taking a picture of that gazebo, it would be a really cool idea for me to include that pathway as a leading line. All right, next let's talk about framing. You can frame your subject by using other elements that are in your image. So people or buildings or nature, trees, anything really. Here's just a really quick example of using an existing doorway to frame a shot. You could, archways are fantastic. You can position your subject in an archway, and that archway creates a frame, and it just draws the eye inward. You can use tree branches, for example, or trees themselves. If you want the tree coming up the side as a nice frame on the side, a branch over top is a nice sort of frame on the top. You can use all kinds of different elements, and it's a really fun experiment to just go out specifically trying to use objects as frames. So you could shoot between the rungs of your step and use 2 of the rungs as frames on the side. It doesn't have to be all 4 sides, I should mention that. But you can use windows, but include the window frame itself. Anything can be a frame. Really, it's about looking and being aware of your surroundings and what you can use as a visual element. All right, next let's talk about using, let's call it layers. It's called a lot of different things. Basically what it refers to is having a foreground, a midground, and a background. That gives you the sort of a 3D effect. It gives the viewer some context and some depth to your image. Here's a really quick sample I threw together just to demonstrate these layers that I'm talking about. So there's a very clear foreground, midground, and background to this image. Clearly the subject is in that middle ground, but the foreground, which is a napkin, and the background, which is sort of a view of my window, they provide a little bit of context, they provide a little bit of depth, they give you an idea of the context of the image. Here's another example where I've actually kind of used two midgrounds. So the foreground in this, to me, is the tall grass. The midground is sort of split between where the dog is and where the cat is, and then the background is the forest behind them. So the next thing I want to talk about is depth of field. We have touched on this one already when we did our aperture lesson. Did we do an entire aperture lesson? Gosh, I gotta go back and check. Anyway, we definitely talked about aperture and how it creates your depth of field. So if you have a really, really wide aperture, just a reminder, a big wide aperture is going to have a shallow depth of field, which means that only your subject is going to be in focus and anything in front of and behind your subject is going to be really blurry. You get to decide what the viewer sees when you use a really shallow depth of field. So for example, there might be all kinds of different, let's say a field of flowers. There's tons and tons and tons of flowers, but you as the photographer get to decide which one you want the viewer to focus on. If you focus on it, literally speaking with your camera, and then everything in front of and behind is going to be blurry. Here's an example using shallow depth of field to direct your focus to the flower on the left. The background behind this image is just the trees that you see behind me throughout the rest of the video, but by creating this shallow depth of field, you don't notice it as much because it's so blurry. Anyway, that's all the rules I'm going to go over for today. There are a ton more, but these are the basics. They're the first ones that you should really get familiar with. So next time you're out taking a picture of literally anything, just try to apply one or maybe even two of these rules. Don't try them all at once. You'll get overwhelmed. You don't have to use them all in every photo. This is sort of a pick and choose kind of list. If I had to say one more piece of advice, it's not a rule per se, but it is a good piece of advice. Just be aware of what's in your frame. I've been caught by this so many times. Your brain and your eyes do a wonderful job of filtering out information that's not necessary to you. And sometimes you are looking at something that looks gorgeous and then you take a photo of it and you look at the photo and you realize, it didn't really turn out the way you expected. Maybe there's clutter or garbage or power lines in it and you didn't really realize that. So just learning to be a little more aware of what's in your shot is going to help too. And sometimes you can do something about it. Sometimes you can pick up the garbage or move the clutter under the rug. Or if it's power lines, obviously you can't move the power lines, but you might be able to move yourself to a different angle where you're not seeing the power lines in your shot. I'm going to show you an example actually that I just recently took. This is a shot that I took of my pony, Tika. We were about 200 feet away, so I was using a telephoto lens. But what I was noticing was in the shot, you could really see a few patches of the pasture there where grass had not grown. And it was just sort of a dirt patch. And it was very distracting, very ugly. So what I did was I got my camera at a slightly lower angle and shot pointing very slightly upwards. And what that did was it took some of the grass, the long grass that was in the foreground, and kind of covered up that dirt patch. It comes with practice. It really, really does. For me, I found that taking a picture and then looking at it was the best way to sort of learn. You take a picture, you look at it, and you see, oh, this particular thing or spot is really detracting from my image. It's not appealing at all. And so what you can do then is basically just retake the photo and try different ways to eliminate that spot. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. I hope that you take those tips and try to practice a little bit with them. And as always, if you have any questions about any of them, you want some clarification, just let me know.
Bye.